Okay, hopefully you remember the difference between the independent and dependent variables as well as the constants that you just did on the last slide, but let's check and see how we did. So an independent variable is the factor that we are changing. It's going to be one thing in our experiment that we want to change for each test. In this case, take a second and answer on this next multiple choice question. What is our independent variable? All right. Our independent variable for John's experiment is going to be the amount of sugar he's using. So he wants to change that for each experiment. That's our independent variable. That is the only thing we want to make sure we're changing. So for our experiment, John's actually going to use a lot of different amounts of sugars. He's going to use 25 grams in one loaf of bread, 50 grams in another, 100 grams, 250 grams, and 500 grams. So he's going to keep on increasing the amount of sugar so that he gets a really clear result of how much sugar he should use to make the bread rise the most. The dependent variable is going to be what we are measuring. So what is our dependent variable in this case? Take a second and answer that now. In this case, the dependent variable would be the size of the loaf of the bread. So what John's going to want to do when he is done baking each loaf of bread is going to be to use some kind of measuring stick or ruler, put it right in the bread and see how much it rose or how high it got. All right. John's going to have to go ahead and come up with a procedure. So his teacher helps him make a procedure, basically the steps that he needs to follow and a list of materials. It's really important that before you actually start an experiment, you have everything that you're going to do throughout that experiment already listed in steps. It makes it nice and easy to follow. It's also really important to have a list of materials so that while you're in the middle of doing that experiment, you don't have to leave and get something else. Make sure if you have a procedure in front of you, whether it's one that you wrote yourself or one that I give you, you should always be reading the entire procedure first before you actually start so that you know throughout the experiment about what's going to be coming up next. John also determines a control group. That's basically just a starting point. In this case, the control group was his grandma's recipe of 50 grams of sugar. So we also need to remember what a constant is. John's going to have some constants in his experiment, and that is the part of an investigation or experiment that is always the same. You want to keep everything except for your independent variable the same. So on the next question, I want you to go ahead and try and figure out what John's constants should be. His teacher reminds him to keep everything else the same so that the only thing we're testing is the amount of sugar. So I want you to try and think of 3 different constants that John could keep the same. If you're having a hard time, think about everything else that goes into baking a loaf of bread. And we're going to come back in just a second and see how many we can think of. All right. Some of the constants you might have included, I've listed here. It could be other ingredients. We don't want to add banana and walnuts to one, but not the other. It could be the same oven used. It could be the time that we let the yeast rise. It could be the brand of ingredients, the amount of time we bake for, the type of pan we use, the air temperature, the humidity, like how much moisture is in the air, the oven temperature, the age of the yeast. This list could go on, but hopefully your constants are found in this list. If not, doesn't mean that they are incorrect because we're going to need a whole bunch of constants for this. Remember, the only thing we should be changing is the actual amount of sugar in his bread. So John's going to go ahead and write out his procedure for his investigation along with a list of materials. He has both of these checked by his teacher, where she checks for any safety concerns. Don't stick your head in the oven, John. I don't know. Then we're going to go ahead and look at some trials. Now, to ensure that our conclusion is accurate and that we get really good results, we're going to do the experiment more than once. So a trial is how many times we try the experiment. You might remember in the video yesterday that you watched about the Mythbusters, they really quickly mentioned that they did each of those trials or each of those drives with the dimpled car 5 times. This makes sure that if we make a mistake in one of our experiments, that's not our final result. We have a chance to see if we can repeat those results over and over. If it is a scientific fact, you should be able to repeat it. So John decides that he's going to test each sugar variable 3 times, meaning he has all of those different amounts, and he's going to test those different amounts 3 times each. John's going to be baking a lot of bread.